All right, so now I like to call this lesson going back in time because Photoshop allows you to basically do that. Go back in time and fix something that you didn't mean to do. How cool would it be if we could do that in real life? But it's basically done through the use of history. And some will call it multiple undos inside Photoshop, but when you're talking about using the history panel and history options inside Photoshop, it's a lot more to it than that. Because you can not only go back to a state that you were in before, you can also bring back just a part of something. Maybe you did something earlier and you just want to bring back part of that. You could certainly do that. So let's talk first about history in general. Now, if you remember from the first lesson talking about preferences, if we go in there and go into the performance, here we've got the history states. And right now the default number is set to 20. And as I mentioned, you want to keep this number relatively low unless you have a massively just unbelievable system with an unbelievable amount of RAM and hard disk space. Then you can increase this number. As you saw, you can go ahead and increase it up to 1,000. But I mentioned keeping that number relatively low because every time you do something in Photoshop, it's going to save it as a version of that. So if you apply a filter, you've applied a correction, it's going to remember that. It's going to record that you did that and have that referenced. So if you need to go back to that, it's going to be able to do that. Now when it does that, it's got to save it somewhere, and it's going to save it on your hard disk space. So imagine it this way. If I've done 30 things to my document, or 20 things in this case, then I've got basically 20 versions of that file somewhere sitting around my hard drive taking up space. So you can imagine if I had to set up to 100 or even 500, that's a lot of work. Now, granted, there's going to be projects where you're going to want an unbelievable number or an infinite number of undos just in case you need to go back. But for general purposes, I've discovered that keeping it around 20 or 30 works relatively well, especially if you've got a pretty good speed on a system. So let's keep that number there. So history, basically it's undos. As I said, virtually unlimited undos. So when you do something inside Photoshop, you go under the image or the edit menu and you go here to undo. And you can see the last thing I did on this particular image was undo, or I flattened the image. So if I wanted to undo that, I would simply select that in the menu. Or if I wanted to redo it, you can go up here and notice what we've got here. We've got the Command Z, which is the first item, which is the undo. Basically undoes what you just did. If you use the same keyboard shortcut or select the same item, it's going to redo what you just undid. So that's all that does. Now, here you have step forward and step backward. So what does that mean? Basically, that means exactly what I was talking about earlier, stepping forward or backward in time. And what it's referencing is your history states. Now, if you go to the window menu and go down here to history, and it's going to open up the history panel. And this will show you everything I've done to this document up till now. Now, as you saw, my history states were set to 20. So if I do 30 things to my item, it's going to forget or basically toss out the first 10 things I did. So it's only going to remember the last 20 things I do to my document. And here you can see all the things that I've done. Now, here we have a snapshot. So by selecting that, it's basically bringing me back to my original document. This is what it looked like when I first opened it. And this is what it looks like after I've done all the various effects I applied to it. And these are all the steps in between. So if I know that I want to go back to the very beginning, I can just select that state and boom, there I am. However, if I'm at that place where I flatten the image and I want to go back to when I did this grain filter here, then it will take me back to that state. And I can continue working from there. Now, if I go back to this state and I apply a new effect, if I go in here and let's perhaps do a blur, so we'll do a Gaussian blur, click OK. Notice what it did. It erased all those other states and now has started a new path. Basically, you can look at it as like a timeline. We erased that timeline at this point in time and started a new one. So now it's going to continue on from here. So I'm just going to Command Z to undo that, and now we've got all those other previous states. So that's how I can jump around to each previous state. So what happens if I want to basically bring back a part of my image? I don't necessarily want to go back to a particular state, but maybe I want to bring back the surfer as it was in the original file. Well, that's going to be involving something called the history brush. Now, the history brush is located in the toolbar. It's, of course, a brush. It's right here. If you click and hold, you've got the history brush and the art history brush. So let's talk about the history brush itself. Works just like a brush inside Photoshop. Now, we do have a chapter on brushes we're going to talk about. But if I select the history brush, and notice right here that my history brush icon is selected on. It's on the original state of my image. Now if I wanted to maybe just bring back the blending change I made here, or maybe I applied this cutout filter. Maybe I want to bring that back into play. Anywhere I put this history brush icon, it's going to bring back that state when I paint. So just to show you an idea, I'm going to select the original state of this document and go into there and just start painting. And notice what it's doing. It's bringing back the original image right inside there. But it's giving me the ability to leave the rest of the effects I applied to this image in place. So it's basically, I'm still at this state here. Notice it's recording my history adjustments that I'm doing here. So it's recording every step I do, but it's referencing this original file. So it's keeping all my effects in place, and we're able to do that. Now, that's bringing back using the basic history brush. Now, the art history brush works a little differently. And a good way to think about the history brush tool is just undo on a brush. You want to undo very specific parts of your images and not necessarily undo something you did on the entire image. That's just what it is. It's undo on a brush. Now, the art history brush works a little differently in that it still references a history state inside your image, but it does it in a kind of painterly fashion. Notice the options we've got up here. We've got various different, and I honestly can't tell you what each one of these do. It's really going to depend on the image, and you select it and experiment and see what it does. But just to give you an idea, if I select a certain feature and just start painting back, it's referencing a history state, but painting it in a very kind of painterly fashion, you see, and hence the name art history, or art history brush, rather. So it brings it back, and it gives me a very unique effect. So, you know, with a little bit of experimentation, you can come up with some very unique techniques there. But that's the art brush and the art history brush. Now, going back in here, I want to talk about the history panel a little bit more. This is basically a snapshot of our original document on what we created. So by referencing this snapshot, we can go back to the way our original file originally was. But let's say I've gotten to this point here. Let's undo. Now, to commit multiple undos really quickly, notice if you go under the Edit menu and do an undo state change, but here, if you select it again, it's going to redo the state change. So it's just going to keep going back and forth. But to keep going up the history panel into those undos, and using the keyboard shortcut, if you hold down the Option or Alt key on it's the Alt key on a PC and an Option key on a Mac, and I'm going to hold down the Command key, and it will be Control key on a PC, and then continuously press the Z key, it does the same thing. It does those multiple undos up until you see the point you want to stop. It's the same thing as going under the Edit menu and doing step backward. So we'll hit step backward, and it's doing the same thing again, step backward. So it's the exact same thing, just using the keyboard shortcut and gets you there a little bit faster. Now, one thing I want to talk about is a snapshot here. So let's say I've gotten to this point in my image. I'm going to go into the flyout menu here, and I'm going to choose New Snapshot. Full document. So now I have two snapshots to refer to. I've got this version and this version. So no matter what I do in the history panel now, if I go and do a number of different items or apply a number of different effects and even do so many that I lose a lot of these history states because I keep adding them, stacking them on, I have now saved a version that I can always bring back. So if I'm at this point in my history panel and I want to bring back parts of this image, simply highlight that and we'll get our history brush and just bring that right back in. So we're isolating that correction. So not only is it going to, by default, save a snapshot of the image once you open it. So it's your original document. This is how it looks when I opened it. But when you get to a certain point of applying certain effects, go in here and create a snapshot. There's also a quick keyboard or the quick button right down here that goes ahead and creates a snapshot as well. So creating a snapshot allows you to basically save the version you're at and always be able to refer to it later. Because you're going to continue to apply effects, and those history states are going to pile up. You're going to lose them, as I mentioned. So saving a snapshot allows you to always go back to that version anytime you want. It's a little easier. In fact, it's way easier than duplicating your document and saving that version. It keeps it all conveniently in one simple document. So, real easy way to go back in time, bring back parts of your image, or bring back the whole image that you started with, all using the history.